Hi, my name is Ethan Mandel, and today I'll be discussing my project for EECE 2160, Embedded Design. So for my project, I chose to focus on a topic that aligns well with my interests outside of electrical engineering. I'm a jazz trumpet player, and the science behind music has always been a topic that's been of particular interest to me. I programmed my DE1-SOC board to take audio input from a piano through the audio jack and convert it into a discrete Fourier transform. From the discrete Fourier transform, the program then identifies the chord being played and displays it on the 7-segment display. The user is then given an option to play chords relative to the chord identified by the program by pressing a button on the keypad, and then the chord is played relative to the tonic chord through the speakers connected to the board. So for example, if the 1 chord was a C major, the 4 chord played through the speakers would be an F major chord. The research component for the project was to determine how I could calculate fewer iterations of the DFT sum and still correctly identify the chord. Due to the hardware limitations of the DE1-SOC, summing 10,000 Fourier coefficients was extremely time consuming, and the calculation was extremely hardware intensive. I had to determine how to reduce the calculation while still maintaining the general shape of the transform signal so it could properly be analyzed. I determined that using the Fourier coefficients of every 10th audio input value allowed for both solid accuracy in identifying the chords as well as acceptable computing time. Using anything lower than every 5th coefficient led to a very long processing time with only marginal improvements in accuracy, and using anything over every 20th coefficient led to very fast computation times but extremely low accuracy. The 5 frequencies containing the max DFT amplitude values were chosen to determine the chord. 5 was chosen as a good approximation of how many peaks actually contain chord tones, as going more than that, you're just getting more and more overtones, which are the same chord tone frequencies. The 5 frequency values were compared against all frequency values, and as long as they were within an acceptable range of a given note, they were designated with that note value. The 5 notes were then narrowed down to 3 based on if there were duplicate tones, and these 3 notes were then compared against a list of all major and minor chords. If there was a match, the chord would be identified on the display, and the user could then play other chords on that keypad. If no chord was identified by the user, then the user was prompted to try again and enter a different chord. So there were many challenges in creating this project, but by far the greatest 3 challenges were successfully capturing and interpreting the audio input, reducing the number of Fourier coefficient sums, and correctly identifying a chord from 5 frequency values. So for the first challenge, I found the most effective way to capture the audio data was to write the audio values that went into the board into a text file and then read the data straight from the text file. So by doing this, I was able to write my initial prototype program for identifying the chord in MATLAB while still using the audio input from the board. MATLAB was chosen because it has much better audio processing tools when compared to C++. So I was able to use like the pre-existing Fourier transform before creating my own program to identify and produce a Fourier transform. So for the next problem, using fewer Fourier coefficients was also a concern of mine when trying to reduce the calculation time of the DFT, because part of the original signal is lost if not all the coefficients are used. So I found that because the signal in had so much noise, a very small fraction of the signal was actually of any value at all. So the trick of using a fractional number of Fourier coefficients still maintained the key components of the signal, even though it was an imperfect frequency spectrum of the signal created. In this way, the partial destruction of the signal acted as a way of filtering the signal, even though the initial signal was impossible to recover from this altered frequency spectrum created. So the last challenge came in the form of a note and chord identification from frequencies. So notes were relatively easy to identify from a frequency value because notes correspond almost exactly with frequencies, with some room for error, as some notes may be slightly flat or sharp. This error varied a little bit with what octave the note was. So at lower octaves, the error was about 2 hertz in frequency, and then on the higher end, it could be up to 128 because every octave doubles the frequency. So A440, which is A4, is half the value of A5, and then A5 is half the value of A6. So, but chords, on the other hand, were very difficult to determine, as often the root of the chord was not the maximum frequency value. So the combination of the 3 notes often led to certain overtones having greater amplitude than others. So sometimes the root of the chord being played may have been the frequency with the 5th greatest intensity, which definitely was a problem. So to counter this problem, I gave priority to lower frequency notes and values as the root of the chord is always lower than the frequency of the 3rd, the minor 3rd, or the 5th in the case of major and minor chords. This improved the identification process, but I believe there are further improvements I can make towards even greater accuracy. So moving on more towards personal. So an example of this type of project. So as much as the project exists to investigate how to optimize DFT calculation for hardware, this project also exists as a proof of concept of a tool for jazz and music education. So for new musicians, it's often difficult to identify chords relative to a tonic chord, as well as hear how common chord progressions sound. So a tool that allows for a new musician to play a chord and then both hear and see chords relative to what they played is both great for ear training and also like visualizing common chord patterns. So for example, a 2-5-1 chord progression is very common in jazz. C major would be D minor 7 to G dominant 7 to C major 7. With the program I created, the user can easily hear and see what make up these 2-5-1 components by just playing C major and recording that into the program and then using the keypad. They're able to easily understand what's going on. So further improvements to calculation speed will make this tool much more effective, as shorter calculations will be required for this to work in any actual practical setting. But I believe that this proof of concept definitely shows that there's value in this idea. So now I'll demonstrate the functionality of my project. Okay, so I switched to my phone camera so I could properly demonstrate the functionality of the board. So I'm going to start by recording my screen so you can also see the terminal. So, okay, the screen is also being recorded now. So I'm going to run the program. It asks me what factor do I want to reduce the DFT calculation by. So a factor of 10, so it's only using 1/10 as many Fourier coefficients as there are in the signal. So now it prompts me to press key 0 to begin recording and key 3 to end the program. So I'm obviously going to press key 0 and I'm going to play a C major chord. So I press button 0, play the C major chord. It's done recording. Obviously it's going to take a few seconds to process. As I mentioned before, if I wanted it to process more quickly, I would use fewer Fourier coefficients, but there also is a greater probability of a incorrect identification of the chord. So should be done in about a second. All right, so it correctly identified the chord as C major, as you can see on the screen. So now I am going to demonstrate the board. If you see here, it says C major. Now I'm going to press 2 on the keypad, and then it's going to show the 2 chord, D minor, 3 chord, E minor, 4 chord, F major, 5 chord, G major, 6 chord, A minor, and the 7 chord, B diminished. So going back to what I mentioned before when I was speaking about functionality in jazz education, for example, you can very clearly hear a 2-5-1. So this is 2, 5, 1, back to C major. And then when I want to end the program and go back to recording another chord, I just press the asterisk here. So, and then it brings me right back to the top of the loop. So I guess I'll show an example of a chord that's just not correctly identified. So I'm just going to play a bunch of notes. Okay, so in this situation, no chord was identified because I just played a lot of notes, which is exactly what should happen. And what happens on the 7-segment display is I just made it show this. This is just a representation of an incorrectly identified chord. And now when I press things on the keypad, it'll just say can't play chords relative to an unidentified chord, which is exactly what I want. So now I'm going to escape the loop, and I'm going to exit, button 2.